Our next speaker, Dr. Anders Sandberg, is a Senior Research Fellow at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. His research deals with the ethics of human enhancement, long-term futures, the management of low probability, high impact risks, systemic risk, emerging technology assessment, and applied rationality when reasoning under high degrees of uncertainty. Sounds like a fascinating day job. Join Dr. Sandberg now as he discusses the tensions between open society with free discourse and the risks around serious information hazards.
Hello, I'm Anders Sandberg, a researcher at the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford. And I'm going to talk about information hazards when truth is not a good thing. So back in somewhere around 2018, a scientist in Antarctica stabbed a colleague for telling him the endings of the books he wanted to read. Obviously, that made him very unhappy, and you can imagine in polar isolation and maybe with the boredom of a limited library, actually having your book spoiled might be a very bad thing, although it might not merit a stabbing. A few years earlier, in 2012, research experiments were published that showed how the bird flu H5N1 virus could be made transmissible among mammals, which matters because that means that it could become a pandemic flu. But this research caused a very vigorous debate, since it actually showed how to make a potentially pandemic flu and publishing the genetic sequence online. Many researchers felt that this should not have been done. This made the world more unsafe, not safer. A bit earlier than that, in the mid-1990s, somebody under the pseudonym Siegfried published an improved synthesis of the potent opioid fentanyl that significantly improved the simplicity of making the drug. Previously, you needed to be a pretty good organic chemist to do it. Now, it could be made by an at-home chemist. And that enabled further rapid development of new production methods for drug producers and non-experts. While you cannot argue that the method itself is responsible for the American opioid epidemic, it certainly enabled part of it by making a previously rather rare drug easily available. So the link between these examples is that it's a situation where true information is bad in some sense. It might be directly harmful, like if a bioterrorist got a hold of the sequence for a pandemic virus. It might be indirectly harmful by enabling drug synthesis that causes addiction and problems. Or it might just cause enragement, like having a good book spoiled. And I'm going to talk now about information hazards. What are they? When do they matter? What can we learn from different fields about mitigate them? And what should we try to do? So information hazards was defined by Nick Bostrom in his paper defining them as risk that arise from dissemination of or the potential dissemination of true information that might cause harm or enable some agent to cause harm. And of course, information can be transmitted in many, many different ways. It can be raw data like a genome for a doomsday pathogen. It can be an idea, like how do you take an already existing virus and turn it into something that's more pandemic? It might be something that just directs attention. Maybe if you're a terrorist, this would be a potentially dangerous point to strike at. It might be a pattern or even a signal that something has happened. You can also get it for a whole bunch of different risks. Perhaps the most familiar form of information hazards are adversarial risks, like if you're running a company and you have a secret sauce and your competitor finds out how to make that secret ingredient or the secret sauce, that could be bad. In war, obviously, you don't want your enemy to know what you're up to. And certainly many people would say that they don't want others to have access to the intellectual property they have. They want to control that. But you can also get some more subtle situations like commitment hazards. You're committed to a course of action and finding out extra information might be risky. And there might also be a knowing too much hazard. And if somebody knows I know a secret that's worth killing for, I might be in trouble. In this case, there is a double information hazard. I might be having hazardous knowledge, but the enemy knowing that I know is also hazardous, at least to me. But there are other forms of information hazards too. Some of them are information asymmetry hazards. Like in the famous paper, The Market for Lemons, the information asymmetry between buyers and sellers of used cars have important economic effects. Conversely, I might not know what illnesses I'm likely to get when I get older, and neither does my insurance company. But if I happen to take a genetic test or I find out that I have a particular disease, suddenly I know much more, and the insurance company might have an information advantage. If everybody could find out but the insurance company didn't know, they would be in trouble, or more likely in this case just raise the premiums. There might be other forms of hazards, sometimes just plain embarrassment, like who let loose wind in a crowded room. We might want to be polite and not point fingers there. Or it might actually be that certain things should not be recognized. In a restaurant, it might be easy to overhear others' private conversations, but we generally try to choose not to hear that. We try to ignore them. And that allows us, of course, to have private conversations in the restaurant, as long as we're all agreeing that we're actually not hearing anything because we're all pretending. It works. But there are other risks that are much more direct. There are various forms of cognitive biases that can get triggered. If I, for example, rattle off my home phone number and then ask you, okay, what's the population of Argentina? Statistically, your answer is going to be pulled towards my phone number. This is absurd because my phone number has nothing to do with the population of Argentina, but our brains, finding two numbers of roughly the same magnitude, tend to mix them up. This anchoring bias, it's very hard to deal with, even if you know about the anchoring bias. There are many other forms of biases that might influence us, and here truthful information might cause interference of various forms. There are also, of course, interesting things like spoiler hazards, where the secrecy of something gives it a value. The twist at the end of a movie might be worth safeguarding quite strongly. But there might also be mindset hazards. If I learn certain information, it might change my way of acting in the world. And this might actually be bad for me or the world. In some cases, this can be very subtle. For example, if I'm a climate researcher and I discover that all climate models have been wrong, they're giving about 5% too high results because of some numerical problem. If I tell the world about that, that might be very useful for IPCC. They should know it. It's very valuable to actually understand how to adjust the climate models. Unfortunately, there is going to be a whole bunch of climate denialists and maybe Fox News who are going to also tell the story about how the climate models were wrong. And we can very predictably know that a lot of people will then hear what was originally a true statement and infer things that are not actual consequences of the statement. And most likely say, oh, that's why we don't need to worry about climate change. It was wrong all along. Similarly, knowing the actual transmission probability of HIV in unprotected sex generally makes people engage in a little bit more unprotected sex because it's not that great. Yet, knowing that probability is super important if you're an epidemiologist or want to actually reduce the spread of the virus. Similarly, there might be other risks that are technological. In some cases, which is of course very salient when thinking about the internet and computer security, you have vulnerabilities in common software, ways of crashing programs remotely, ways of hacking people's mail servers, and so on. There might also be both high-tech versions of this, various vulnerabilities that would allow security agencies to get into a computer, but also low-tech vulnerabilities. Many kids today having to undergo teaching using Zoom and other internet systems, figure out ways of tricking them. If they don't want to go to school, they might deliberately write the wrong password enough times that the program locks them out. And in some cases, this has taken the adults weeks to figure out what the kids figured out. In this case, the information hazard is telling other kids about how they could do this, because then they wouldn't get their education. There are also, of course, information hazards that might be pure software. In some sense, an artificial intelligence program could be an information hazard that's very active and is running between computers. So there is a lot of different possibilities here. I generally think that we can distinguish between the external information hazards that are about something out there in the world and could cause an adversary or a clumsy and stupid agent to cause harm. So this might be everything from nuclear launch codes over to how to make various cyber attacks. Then there are the direct information hazards, which are maybe the most impressive and mysterious ones, but also relatively rare. Information that directly cause harm. And I think mindset hazards and attention hazards are good examples. But there might be ideas that are just causing people real trouble. I know a few examples where particular paradoxes and problems have gotten at least academics into trouble. It's not so much that anybody else cared about it, but they drove themselves almost mad with this particular problem. And then there are the mindset hazards, the things that affect our social sharing of information. And it's tricky here because, of course, the mindset hazards slowly shade over into framing, marketing, and the normal problems we have with disinformation, misinformation, and pure bullshit. Harry Frankfurt had a very useful definition using analytic philosophy that bullshit is when you speak without caring about the truth of what you're saying. Somebody who tries to deceive you, they care about the truth a lot. They want to keep the truth from you. But the bullshit just says whatever sounds good. And Frankfurt argued that bullshitting might actually be more pernicious for our society, simply because we're messing up our knowledge system. Our collective epistemology gets clogged up by fake news, which is not even good fake news. It's just that it's convenient to believe that whatever came out of the latest troll factory, and that messes up our ability to actually figure out what's true. However, in this talk, I'm going to try to deal more with the things that have something to do with truth. And the reason I care about this is that I do a lot of research about global catastrophic and existential risks. I try to understand the biggest threats to humanity now and in the future, and maybe how we can get around them. Now, Thomas V. Morris had the double power principle. The more power something has for good, the more it correspondingly has for ill. And if I want to believe that I'm doing anything more of an academic stamp collecting, but I actually think that some of my research might one day matter for making the world safer, I should imagine that my research could also make the world more unsafe. So in some cases, we might get data hazards, finding examples of pathogens that could be very dangerous. Or idea hazards, like potential doomsday weapon schemes. My boss, Nick Bostrom, has actually told me, Anders, you're not allowed to come up with any doomsday weapon during office hours. I've been struggling not to come up with doomsday weapons because it's so fun. The problem is, of course, that once you come up with a doomsday weapon, you might tell it to somebody who might tell it to somebody else who might actually think, hey, that might actually be worthwhile. And that is, of course, the real problem with attention hazards. There might be potentially quite dangerous technology that's not terribly hard. Most conceivable doomsday weapons are grandiose, interesting schemes involving physics that we can hardly do. But some of the very, very bad things that could happen in the world doesn't require that much equipment. And there might also be psychological and social risk. If you scare the public or policymakers enough, they might do stupid things that cause dangerous things. It might be that the public lose hope and think, oh, there's so many threats to humanity. So, well, better live for today and not care about future generations because we're hardly going to be any. Or decision makers might say, oh, we need to keep a lot of secrets and do a lot of things to prepare for this. And the most important thing is to avoid panic. It turns out that it's a myth that people generally panic when they get bad news or when they get told that there is an imminent disaster. In most disasters, people actually behave quite nicely. People generally pull together in the early phases of a disaster. As I'm speaking, we have had about a year of the COVID pandemic. And after the initial confusion, at least the first wave was handled rather well in most countries. The problem starts when things just go on and go on and go on and people lose hope. But it's very rare that you get panic in the streets. So that kind of movie trope, quite often decision makers think that they need to call out the police and military and do grandiose things because there's bad news afoot. Instead, they should probably show that there is hope. We're dealing with the bad news. So getting back to my research on existential risks, it seems like research and policy work requires telling people things that are true and building trust. But generally, academic institutions are crappy at information safety. Our job is to come up with anything and then write big books about it and tell everybody who cares to listen what great results we have developed. That is, of course, a problem when getting to information hazards. So I already mentioned a few examples, like the Siegfried fentanyl synthesis. In some classic debates, we have had the conversation about, should you tell the public that certain kinds of locks are unsafe, or that certain pieces of software are unsafe? After all, this is going to help thieves and villains, but it's also going to help people make better decisions. We have interesting examples in the field of geoengineering, where some people have argued that we shouldn't even look into the possibility of handling climate change by adding aerosols to the stratosphere or doing something else. Because if people believe that, they are going to care less about fixing climate change. And it turns out that there might also be risks in even figuring out how to do it well, because it might be possible for a nation unilaterally to do something. So you could imagine a low-lying tropical nation deciding, okay, we're going to get flooded if climate change keeps on making the sea levels rise. So we're going to dump a lot of aerosols into the stratosphere. Us Scandinavians are going to be very unhappy about it, but there might be little we can do about it. So maybe the world would be safer if it was less clear on how to do it well. There are also other weird examples. One of my favorite examples is a paper that recently arrived showing that if you find new gecko species, this was written by herpetologists interested in lizards and amphibians in southern China, whenever they published a paper, that species started to decline. And they realized that's because the collectors are reading our papers. So they have this problem that publishing papers about species might be bad for them. On the other hand, we also have a long-running debate in science about what about studying intelligence and genetics, especially as linked to race. Many people say that's bad. You should not do that at all because it's going to help the racists. Others would say, how do we even know that would help the racists? Maybe there is no correlation whatsoever. So maybe we should do an investigation. And as you can guess, the acrimony is pretty intense here. So what do we learn from communities that have been trying to handle hazardous information? The most long-running conversation has been about locks and their safety. And this goes back literally to the 1700s when people started making precision locks that looked like they could be powerful, but also people made bad locks that thieves easily could get through. And generally, the openness side won out. It's regarded that maybe you don't need to tell people exactly how to break the locks, but showing that some locks are less safe than others is actually a good thing to do, because then people can buy better locks. And the same thing seems to be true for software security. Showing that something is insecure, that is important so people can switch, or we can put pressure on the people making the software. So you want to have the right kind of disclosure mechanism. Typically, if you discover that an operating system is insecure, you tell the managers privately, and then you give them a few months to fix it, and then you announce it to the world. This way, you both get the advantage of being able to fix a problem, but maybe the bad guys don't get the advantage of hearing of it. This, of course, only works if the bad guys don't already know it. And typically, thieves know what locks are bad. And many hackers are much more well-resourced than security resources. Generally, of course, in academia, we regard openness as a very important part of science and fiercely defend it academically. Indeed, it's part of, in Germany, it's kind of a constitutional right to do freedom of research. Somebody telling me that I may not research something is infringing on my fundamental rights. And part of that is a classic liberal realization that we're better off sharing knowledge. During the Renaissance and earlier, the idea was that knowledge should be secret. Only the noble and right people should know about it. If knowledge was widely known, it would lose its value. What we realized during the Enlightenment was rather, if we share knowledge, we have more of it. And generally, it makes the world much, much better. The problem with information hazards is this is the one exception. Another interesting issue here is how do you maintain good management of information hazards in an organization? So I tried asking various establishment figures around Britain, and I generally found that doesn't seem to be any special magical training you get once you join an intelligence agency or some other government department. The general thing was people tell you, okay, we're going to manage sensitive stuff. This is important work. You better be careful about it. Maybe you have to sign a piece of paper. One ex-military told me, and I'm usually muttering something about waterboarding in the background to get them to feel it. The important part here is that the incentives and motivation to follow the protocols inside the organization are quite powerful. And most of that is not followed because it's a rule or somebody's threatening you, but just because your friends and the co-workers are doing the same thing. What matters is what people and the organization tries to achieve and how well this is traded against other things like convenience. So there are technical aspects you can also look at, like security engineering, and start thinking about, can we borrow cool things from security engineering and do formal risk analysis, risk assessment, and risk mitigation and vulnerability assessment. This is quite powerful and useful if you really handle a lot of dangerous information. But a lot of the work here is based on a particular model of what the problem is. It's usually that somebody is outside trying to attack you, some adversary. And this is also true in information security. And generally, we tend to think about what information must not leak and how could it leak. But quite often, people miss why should it not be leaked. The value of information is quite important. Indeed, an information leak is significant if it increases the ability of your adversary to either do harm or gain the information or tools to do more harm. And we should not forget that many adversaries are not evil. They're stupid. They're the people in your organization who didn't get the memo or think that cutting corners would be effective. Intelligence agencies have, of course, been struggling with this for a long time. And they use a lot of common sense approaches and compartmentalization. Everybody doesn't know what everybody else knows, and that helps to some degree. You have elaborate security classification schemes into official, secret, and top secret, to use the UK example, which is useful to sorting things through. Just having different colors on the folders has apparently stopped a number of leaks when people notice, wait a minute, you're not supposed to carry a red folder onto the parking lot. But in the end, it's more about organizational culture. In some cases also almost perniciously. Security clearances are very important for your career. So if you gain a security clearance, you want to keep it because you probably want to keep your night job. It also becomes integrated into your person, your self-image, which is great. Except that it also means that you self-propagate certain values. The people vetting people for getting security clearances have a particular mindset, and that might be diverging slowly, at least in the US, from the mainstream. And there is a real risk here that you get a self-propagating security culture that might be achieving some forms of security, but might be having very different values, which means that there you get a real problem when a Snowden shows up who doesn't quite share the same values. And generally, the problem is that leaks happen quite easily. Secrets do have half-lives, and these are decreasing. They can become public because of accidents or because somebody deliberately leaks them. And it's also easier and easier to have an infrastructure for distributing the secret. So generally, understanding what the best before date or best consumed before date of your information is really valuable. And it's possible to construct clever privacy and the information engineering solutions like differential privacy. But like encryption, it's very fragile. It only takes one mistake with the system and you're no longer having that much control. People have also been looking at conspiracies, and generally there are not as many conspiracies as conspiracy theories would like to think. Because after all, if the world is being run by the Illuminati, that's great because somebody is in charge. It's much more horrifying that things are just happening because people are people. But you get business cartels fairly often, and they seem to be a little bit more stable than the proper conspiracies because they have a good motivation. There is good money in raising prices together with your competitors. And you also don't need that many people. You only need to have randomly run into a few of your competitors on the golf course and exchange a few words, which means that the risk of leaking is much less. Still, the median time from formation to discovery of discovered business cartels is about 5 years. Some have lasted for decades, but most don't last that long. It's actually really hard to maintain this. Another interesting topic that's been discussed is, could there actually be forbidden knowledge that we morally should not know? And clearly you can get knowledge through unacceptable means. The classic example is some of the data from the Nazi camps where they did medical experiments. Most of it is relatively scientifically crappy, and fortunately for everybody, there is no need for using it. But a few tables of data actually could be cited as useful evidence, except that it came about in the most atrocious way possible. So here there is a debate about, should we even be referring to that data? In some sense, humanity knows these facts, except that it knew them because of a crime. But there might also be that there are some things that have consequences that are very bad. And people quite often have very strong views here. And generally, they tend to be wrong in weird ways because they build up a model about how a certain result or a certain line of inquiry is going to help racists or undermine human dignity. And indeed, it's not terribly hard to find academics who've been proclaiming that entire branches of science must be stopped because that is wrong. And a few decades later, we have anyway used these branches of science, and it didn't lead to racism or the loss of human dignity. Still, academic self-censorship is very common. And many people avoid certain lines of inquiry because they know, oh, that's going to be so controversial and messy. I just want to have peace and quiet here. The interesting thing is, it's also very much not so much due to outside pressures. Certainly it happens that people accuse researchers for being transphobic or racist or other bad things. But most of it happens when people just consider what they want to do. And they're based on unspoken rules and internalized ideas, which in many cases people don't even have a conversation about. So they're contradictory. In many cases, they're trying to handle information hazards, but doing a very bad job of it because we don't talk about it. And generally, information concealment is everywhere in big organizations. Chernoff and Sornet did a wonderful survey about how information concealment played a very important role in many man-made disasters. People are hiding things because it makes them look good, or because they might cause trouble, or because they think that's risky. And then that weakens the preparedness, the avoidance of a risk, or the response when it's happening, or the recovery. You get situations where people literally in the Chernobyl plant in the control room saying everything is fine, while the guy running the plant just came in from outside and noticed that, yeah, one of the reactor buildings is literally on fire. And this is very much because we don't do information hazard management that well. I think we can sum things up and say there are ways of thinking about hazardous information that make us better at handling it. The weapon of openness works when the utility for the good guys tend to go up the more people who know the information. And it's fairly likely that you will rediscover the information. Rare and hard to rediscover information, on the other hand, that's the one you might want to be careful about. That's a little bit like the chemical synthesis. That might be a little bit like the spoilers for the really good mystery novels. But generally, you can use risk management principles here. And you should generally notice that if you end up with a secret, you have trouble. It might be better to decide to do research that avoids getting that secret, avoids amassing personal data, avoids getting those things that are going to give you a headache a bit down the line. It also seems that you need to learn about different domains. You need to talk to people. You need to actually get outside views. And generally, people are overconfident about their ability to judge things, which is a problem because information hazards makes everybody get into James Bond mode. They think that they need to take the secret to the grave. But if they actually talk to a colleague that they could trust, they would find out, oh yes, that's generally known and it doesn't work because of this. Instead, what you might want to do is build your organization culture that allow you to have trustworthy collaborators. You want to improve the safe communications. You want to actually look at concrete ways of handling it. We have done that to some extent in computer security. We also found ways where institutions can make things worse, like markets for selling exploits online. The gain of function research shows that deciding what to research matters a lot, and setting up international institutions that allow us to act as clearinghouses might be a useful way of handling risky information, which might also be true for the problem of the lizards. We might want to have shared institutions also for geoengineering. Generally, it seems like self-censorship rarely works, but you might want to have an agreement about how to do a responsible disclosure. I want to say that information hazards are not unknown and are being managed all the time in many domains. Not well necessarily, but not too badly either. It's when the stakes get really high, we need to step up and make the quality better. And this is not just a practical problem, but also an ethical problem. We don't want to cause information externalities. Most of us want to make the world better by our thinking, our data gathering, and our talking. And generally figuring out where that rare, hard to rediscover information, whether that is sensitive, that's a good starting point. We will also never be able to avoid uncertainty. We just need to learn how to live with that. But we need to be explicit about what we're uncertain about. We need to actually speak the language of acting under uncertainty. And that might be annoying. That might be hard. But it's much better than discovering one day that the front cover of the newspaper tells you that your discovery has caused a disaster. The best way of preventing disasters is to think a little bit ahead and try to choose another pathway. Thank you.